The bells of Europe rang with confidence. From the white stone towers of Paris to the sun-drenched harbours of Venice, the world seemed ordered, blessed, and unbreakable. Every morning began with prayer and trade. Carts creaked across cobblestones, guild banners fluttered in the wind, and merchants shouted the value of silk and spice, as if wealth itself could drown out uncertainty. Cathedrals pierced the sky like promises carved into stone, their stained glass windows catching light that people called divine. To live then was to believe that the universe had already chosen its rulers, its language, its God. Everything else was noise beyond the horizon. And yet, the horizon was widening. Ships left port heavier each season, their holds packed with pepper, cloth, and unseen stowaways. The scent of nutmeg masked the odour of decay from the bilge. Farther inland, farmers worked soil that no longer obeyed the seasons. Rains came too soon, then not at all. Still, harvest festivals continued, and children danced beneath garlands of wheat, unaware that the fields were growing tired. In the courts of kings, mirrors of polished bronze reflected an age drunk on its own perfection. Courtiers whispered of art and prophecy, of relics discovered and saints reborn. Scholars in candle-lit rooms copied the words of Aristotle, convinced that knowledge had already reached its summit. Even the poorest villager, kneeling before a painted cross, believed that salvation and order flowed down from above in an endless stream. It was a world so certain of itself that doubt felt like sin. But the air was changing. Caravans from the east arrived late, their camels thinner, their guards more silent than before. Stories travelled faster than maps could hold them of distant towns emptied overnight, of skies that darkened without storm. Most dismissed these tales as the exaggerations of travellers too long on the road. Europe had heard rumours of calamity before. It always survived. Faith was the shield, reason the sword, and both were thought unbreakable. In Florence, goldsmiths hammered coins that glittered brighter than the sun. In London, the new stone bridge stood as proof that human hands could defy the river's rage. Everywhere, men built higher, prayed louder, and feasted longer. When a sickness struck livestock, or a strange frost killed the vines, priests declared it a test of virtue, not a warning. The people listened and returned to work. What could truly threaten a continent so blessed, so guided by heaven? The market squares told a different truth if one listened closely enough. Beneath the songs of merchants came coughs that lingered too long, and in the corners where beggars huddled, the air smelled faintly of rot. Physicians spoke of bad humours, of the need for balance and bloodletting. None imagined that balance itself was already slipping away. Beyond the Alps, winter refused to leave. Lakes froze deeper, and herds starved in their pens. In the lowlands, strange mists rose from rivers at dawn, making villages seem haunted even in daylight. Some said the earth had begun to change its breath. Others whispered that the end of days was near, though most laughed at such superstition. Humanity had conquered enough nature, hunger, even the fear of eternity. Surely nothing invisible could undo what centuries had built. Still, unease crept like damp through stone. Letters from traders in the east spoke of deserted caravans, of ports closed without explanation. The wise men of Genoa dismissed it as local unrest. The Venetian Senate cared only for the flow of goods. Even the church, keeper of souls, found comfort in denial. God's world could not simply rot from within. On feast days, incense rose through cathedrals thick as fog, covering the smell of unwashed bodies. The faithful knelt shoulder to shoulder, believing proximity to holiness would keep them safe. No one questioned how easily breath moved between them. The same air that carried hymns also carried something else unseen, patient, waiting. Across Europe, art flourished. Painters layered gold leaf over wood, musicians tuned new instruments, and poets wrote of eternal love. Every act of beauty became a quiet defense against decay. But beauty, too, was fragile. Behind the canvases, apprentices coughed through the nights. In monasteries, monks who illuminated sacred texts began to vanish, their work left half-finished, the ink fading where the quill had slipped from their hands. To wander the streets of any great city, then, was to feel civilization at its most alive and most unaware of its own heartbeat. The smell of bread, the laughter from taverns, the chiming of distant bells all formed a rhythm so steady it felt immortal. yet every rhythm carries its silence inside it, waiting. No one sensed how near that silence had come. The world of the 1,340 seconds believed it was approaching perfection. It had charted the seas, baptized continents, and built monuments meant to last until judgment itself. It trusted its institutions more than its instincts. When the wind shifted from the south, warm and faintly metallic, no one paused to wonder. When flocks of birds changed their paths, priests said it was simply the will of God. In truth, nature had begun to whisper its warning in languages humanity had forgotten to hear. Soon, the same ships that carried silk and scripture would carry something that neither prayer nor medicine could name. It would arrive quietly, hidden in the dark corners of wooden hulls, clinging to the fur of creatures no one noticed. It would cross borders faster than armies, faster than rumor. And by the time anyone realized, the bells that once proclaimed life would toll for death. No one knew the world had already started dying. The light of Europe still glowed, marketplaces bursting with colour, monasteries echoing with chants, lords riding beneath banners embroidered with saints. Yet even as the continent celebrated its prosperity, a shadow moved unseen along the veins of its trade routes. The audience stands at that moment now at the final breath before history changes tone. From this calm, the next whisper will rise, faint, uncertain, and carried on the wind from the east. The first message of death did not come in words, it came in silence. Far beyond Europe, across the Mongol steppes and the pale deserts of Central Asia, caravans moved like slow-moving constellations under a restless sky. The Silk Road still shimmered with purpose, horses laden with bolts of Chinese silk, spices from India, and dreams of gold carried westward. Each hoofbeat echoed through empires, binding worlds together in fragile prosperity. Yet among those caravans, something invisible had begun to travel, something lighter than dust, yet heavier than fate. It began quietly, in villages that vanished before any rider reached them. Travellers spoke of strange fevers that bloomed overnight, of black swellings that pulsed beneath the skin like bruised fruit. A single cough, a single breath, and an entire family would fall before dawn. The stories rode on the wind, crossing borders faster than any merchant could. Most dismissed them. The East had always whispered of plagues, divine punishments, the wrath of spirits, but the tales were said to fade as quickly as they came. Still, the silence after them lingered. In the vast Mongol Empire, trade was life itself. From Samarkand to Karakoram, from the edges of Persia to the frozen north, goods moved through outposts guarded by soldiers and priests alike. But the empire's roads were not only paths for silk and silver, they were arteries open to the world. In a system built to connect, no one considered what else connection might carry. Fleas clung to fur, rats nested among grain sacks, and a microbe no human eye could see waited patiently inside them. It had no kingdom, no god, no allegiance, only hunger. As the Mongols warred among themselves, their armies spread both victory and infection. At first, the symptoms were mistaken for common illness, fatigue, fever, the chill that passed quickly. But then came the swellings, black and hard, bursting with death. Villages along the steppe began to burn their dead, then their homes, hoping to trap the sickness in the flames. None realized it had already moved on. By the early 1,340 seconds, rumors reached the great trading hubs of the Silk Road. Caravans arrived late, or not at all. Letters spoke of cities emptied overnight, of marketplaces where only flies remained. Entire regions of Central Asia fell silent, their roads left empty except for scavengers and wind. Chroniclers in distant monasteries later wrote of a great pestilence in the east, but few paid attention. Europe's gaze was turned inward, busy with kings, wars, and relics. The world had grown too confident to imagine that something unseen could move faster than empire. At the edges of the Black Sea, the Genoese port of Kaffa stood as a bridge between continents. Christian merchants trading beneath the watch of Muslim rulers, a mosaic of languages and alliances. In 1346, Mongol forces laid siege to the city. For months, arrows and disease rained from the sky. Then, as legend tells it, something unprecedented occurred. When the Mongol army began dying by the thousands, their generals ordered the bodies of the infected to be catapulted over Kaffa's walls. Whether the act was strategy or desperation, it carried with it a truth too small to see, and too immense to stop. Inside the city, panic grew. Merchants fled aboard ships bound for Constantinople, Venice, and Genoa. The holds were filled with goods, grain, and rats. The rats carried fleas, and within those fleas, the hidden passenger that had turned the east to dust. The plague, though no one called it that yet, was already on the move again, tucked beneath the illusion of escape. Out at sea, sailors began to fall ill. Some died before the first harbour appeared. Others tossed bodies overboard, believing the ocean could wash sin and sickness away. But the sea did not cleanse it connected. The Mediterranean became a mirror of the Silk Road, its currents carrying the same invisible cargo. Each gust of wind over canvas, each rope pulled by human hands, became a link in a chain no one had meant to forge. Back in Asia, those who survived the first wave spoke of the sky turning strange, of birds flying low, of wolves gathering near the abandoned towns. Chroniclers recorded none of this directly, but the oral stories passed through generations, murmurs about a time when death walked faster than shadow. Even in silence, the world seemed to sense something was wrong. Trade slowed, temples emptied, and nomads spoke of a curse that moved with the moonlight. Yet the merchants kept riding. Profit was stronger than fear, and denial rode beside them. The caravans returned to Persia, to the ports of the Levant, to the narrow harbours of the Mediterranean. With every arrival came a new beginning and a quiet end folded inside it. The same patterns that had once carried silk and language now carried extinction. The first message of death had been sent not by armies or kings, but by the simplest exchange between worlds. A flea on a rat in a sack of grain. A ship sailing west, its crew humming hymns as they watched the waves. None knew what travelled with them, sleeping in the dark below deck. Soon, those songs would stop. The whispers that began in the east would reach every corner of the known world, and Europe, so full of faith, so certain of its destiny, would be the next to listen. They came at dawn, silent and without warning. A small fleet of Genoese ships drifted toward the Sicilian harbour of Messina, their sails torn and their flags hanging limp in the breeze. The fishermen who first saw them from the shore said the ships looked abandoned, moving without purpose, carried by the tide rather than by human will. As the first rays of morning touched the hulls, the truth began to surface. These were not trading vessels returning home. They were ghosts. Curiosity drew the townspeople to the docks. Children pointed at the ships, laughing at the strange stillness, while merchants wondered if the sailors inside carried news from the east. No one saw the movement on deck, a figure stumbling, a faint cough, a shape collapsing into shadow. When the harbour guards boarded the first ship, the air that escaped from within was foul and heavy, the scent of decay mixed with salt and pitch. They opened the hatches, and history changed its breath. Inside, the crew lay scattered across the deck, some slumped against barrels, others sprawled in unnatural stillness. Their skin was mottled, their throats swollen, and on their bodies bloomed dark lumps, black as burnt fruit. A few were still alive, whispering prayers that ended in dry gasps. One sailor, his eyes clouded with fever, reached out to the intruders and spoke a single word before dying. No one understood what he said, but the gesture alone was enough to send the men fleeing back to shore. The first panic spread faster than the disease itself. Bells rang through Messina, summoning priests and city elders. People argued whether the ships should be burned or blessed. The church insisted the dead be given rights. Merchants pleaded that the goods aboard be salvaged spices, silks, and coin worth more than reason. In the confusion, the docks became a gathering place for the living and the dying alike. Those who came to watch could not yet see the danger in the air they breathed. By nightfall, a strange quiet settled over the harbour. Dogs barked and then went silent. Candles burned low in the windows of the city's wealthy quarter. The priests who had entered the ships did not return. The wind shifted inland, carrying with it the scent of something no prayer could sanctify. People began to whisper of divine punishment of sins so deep that God had chosen to turn his face away from Sicily. In the monasteries, monks recorded the first lines of what would become a chronicle of sorrow. Ships came from the east, full of death. None who touched them lived. Some believed the devil himself had travelled within the holds. Others said it was a curse sent by the Mongols or the infidels. No one yet spoke of rats, or fleas, or the unseen kingdom of disease. In 1347, the idea that the smallest of creatures could fell, the mightiest of men, was unthinkable. It was easier to believe in wrath than in chance. The sailors' belongings were scattered through the markets within days. Coins changed hands, silks were cut and sold, spices spilled across the counters of apothecaries. In every transaction, death multiplied. The city that had once thrived on the flow of trade now drank its own poison, one bargain at a time. The priests prayed, the healers bled, and the air grew heavier. Soon the bell towers no longer called for mass, they tolled only for the dead. One chronicler later wrote that the city died of its own curiosity. Perhaps it was true. For centuries, Messina had been the gateway to the known world, a place where goods and ideas converged. It had survived wars, fires, and famine. But this arrival was different. The enemy had no face. The ships that once brought wealth now carried a silence that seeped through every doorway, every breath. In the streets, people began to wear charms, bits of bone, pieces of parchment, anything they thought might hold power. The church organized processions, hoping to cleanse the air with incense, but the smoke only deepened the suffocating haze. Some fled into the hills, believing distance could save them. Others locked their doors and waited for divine mercy. It did not come. Within weeks, Messina was a city of closed shutters and unanswered knocks. The same docks that had welcomed the world now stood empty, their ropes swaying in the wind. Ships that arrived afterward found no one to greet them. The sea was calm, but the air stank of endings. Across the straits, word of the disaster spread like rumour and wind. Sailors carried tales of ghost ships, of dark sores that blossomed overnight, of cities cursed by the east. Few believed it could reach them. Fewer still imagined that the sickness had already left the harbour, carried inland by those who fled before the gates were closed. The first contagion was not of the body, it was disbelief. They would later say that the plague began here, that the first spark of Europe's great dying was lit upon these docks. But at the time, no one knew the scale of what had begun. They only knew the smell of the air, the weight of silence, the fear that lingered after the bells stopped ringing. As the final ship drifted away from Messina, uncrewed and untended, the tide carried it west toward the next harbour, the next awakening, the next prayer unanswered. What left Sicily that autumn was more than death. It was the beginning of a story the world had forgotten how to tell, one where every connection became a doorway, and every harbour a grave. The map of Europe began to look less like land and more like a wound. From the first whisper in Messina, the sickness fanned outward along every artery of trade and pilgrimage, following routes carved by centuries of human ambition. Ships carried it across the Mediterranean like drifting embers. Carts rolled it through the valleys of Italy, the markets of France, the vineyards of Spain. What had once connected the world in prosperity now bound it together in ruin. At first, the pattern seemed random, a fever here, a sudden death there. Towns closed their gates, believing walls could hold back air. But the plague respected no boundary. It rode in wool and wheat, in letters and prayers, in the fur of the smallest travellers. A merchant's caravan from Pisa, a sailor's handshake in Marseille, a pilgrim's blessing at a shrine, each gesture passed the invisible along. The disease moved not like an army, but like a rumour, unseen yet unstoppable. By winter, the ports had become mirrors of each other. Venice coughed as Messina had coughed, its narrow canals carrying silence deeper than water. Marseille's ships burned at anchor, their cargo turned to ash in desperate ritual. In Genoa, the city fathers ordered the sick to be sealed in their homes. The streets filled with the sound of hammers boarding up doors, and then only the sound of wind. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated: denial, fear, then the stillness of surrender. Monks who kept records tried to trace the movement. Their parchment maps began to darken with ink, each town marked with the sign of the cross. Within months, the lines formed a vast shape across Europe, a black tide swallowing kingdoms, one harbour at a time. In Paris, scholars argued over cause. Was it corruption in the air? An alignment of planets? God's hand? Or the devil's breath? The answers did not matter. The counting of the dead outpaced the counting of days. The contagion spread north through the Alps, carried by traders who fled south to escape it. The logic of fear betrayed geography itself. Every attempt to flee became another road for infection. Inns became tombs, markets became graveyards. Even the roads seemed cursed, the dust stirred by hooves and wheels thick with memory. England watched from across the Channel, confident that the sea would serve as barrier. But in the summer of 1348, a single ship from Normandy brought death to Dorset's shores. Within weeks, the sickness reached London, a city too dense, too proud, too alive to imagine emptiness. Chroniclers wrote of pits so wide and deep that none could number the bodies. The bells that marked the hours began to ring without pause, until even the priests were too few to pull the ropes. Meanwhile, the plague crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, where prayers turned to wails. In Germany, entire villages disappeared between one census and the next. In the lowlands, windmills turned with no one to stop them. The geography of death was precise. Rivers carried it inland, mountains delayed it, winter slowed it, but nothing stopped it. For those still untouched, the map became a living nightmare. People spoke of it as if it were a creature, crawling slowly across the earth, devouring everything in its path. Messengers were murdered for fear they carried the sickness in their breath. Cities refused to admit travellers, others barred their own citizens from leaving. In Florence, watchmen patrolled the gates at night, killing anyone who tried to escape. Still, the sickness came not through the gates, but through the air itself. The records from this time read like poetry of despair. One monk in Avignon wrote, "The dead are more than the living, and the living are already dead." Another wrote that God must have withdrawn his angels and left only shadows behind. Yet amid the dread, there were patterns, small, cruel consistencies that made the map predictable. The richer the port, the faster it fell. The denser the city, the quicker it starved of breath. Civilization itself became a design flaw. Even the cartographers began to change their language. The ornate flourishes that once adorned maps, vines, dragons, and saints gave way to simple black stains marking regions lost. The beauty of knowledge turned into the geometry of mourning. The same ink that once drew roads of progress now recorded their undoing. From Constantinople to Dublin, from Naples to Oslo, the contagion completed its dark pilgrimage. Some towns vanished entirely, their names surviving only in the margins of old ledgers. Others endured half alive, the survivors too few to bury the dead. The numbers were beyond comprehension, tens of millions within 4 short years. It was as if time itself had been compressed, centuries of death folded into a single breath of history. In the aftermath, Europe stood like a torn tapestry, every thread still connected, but the image unrecognizable. The very systems that had built its prosperity, trade, faith, connection, had become the pathways of destruction. The continent learned, too late, that unity could be as lethal as isolation. Those who survived drew maps of memory instead of land, tracing where their loved ones had lived, where they had fallen, where the bells had last rung. The geography of grief replaced the geography of power. The map of Europe, once a testament to progress, now looked like a wound that refused to close. And yet, beneath that wound, life still stirred a faint pulse among ruins, waiting for its chance to heal. Soon, the story would turn inward, moving from continents to doorways, from nations to the faces of the living and the dead. The plague was no longer a line across a map. It had become a presence inside every home, every prayer, every breath. They thought the mask would protect them, but it was only a mirror of their fear. In the dim rooms of plague-stricken cities, the physicians of the 14th century stood between the living and the dead, with nothing but rituals and hope. They wore long robes waxed against contagion, gloves drawn to the elbows, and over their faces, the now iconic mask, a bird's beak stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth. The air that passed through it was meant to purify, to separate the doctor from the miasma of death. But no mask could filter despair. In their journals, the healers wrote of the smell, the sweetness of rot, the sharp sting of infection that clung to every surface. They moved through narrow streets, summoned by desperate families, offering tinctures and prayers in equal measure. They prescribed fumigations of juniper, burned rosemary by the sickbed, and opened veins to release what they believed were poisoned humours. Each act of care became a ritual of futility. The plague moved faster than understanding, and the men who studied medicine became its first witnesses, and soon, its victims. Many physicians fled their posts, abandoning cities for the countryside. Others stayed, not from courage but from disbelief. They wanted to observe, to record, to make sense of what was happening. But sense was the first casualty. The symptoms defied order. Fevers that rose in hours, swellings that split open, blood dark as ink. The plague was chaos disguised as pattern, and every pattern they traced dissolved in death. The sick called for the doctors, and the doctors came, though they knew each house might be their last. They touched the dying with rods instead of hands, examined sores through veils, and murmured Latin verses beneath their breath. For the first time, knowledge felt dangerous. The closer they studied the sick, the faster they themselves fell ill. Students who once dreamed of curing the world now prayed simply to die quickly. The universities offered no salvation. In Paris and Padua, scholars debated whether the stars had conspired against mankind. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI ordered massive fires to be kept burning around him, believing smoke would ward off contagion. In every city, the learned clung to theories, while the ground beneath them filled with graves. Their books spoke of balance, of harmony in the body, but what they faced was neither balanced nor merciful. It devoured the wise and the ignorant alike. The people watched the doctors and saw not healers, but omens. The beaked mask became a symbol of dread, the bird that circled before death arrived. Children cried when they saw it. Those who survived claimed the doctors carried death in their robes, spreading it from house to house. In a way, they were right. The physicians were conduits, drawn to the dying as moths to flame, and the plague used them as messengers. The very act of compassion became transmission. Some healers turned to faith, kneeling before altars in half-empty chapels. Others turned to alchemy, grinding emeralds into dust or boiling mercury to chase away evil vapors. A few recorded their failures in trembling script, hoping their words might help those who came after, if anyone came after. "We are learning the language of death," one physician wrote, "but it has no grammar." At night, the healers dreamed of air too thick to breathe. They woke to find that the dream had followed them into daylight. Every street smelled the same: smoke, vinegar, and grief. Their hands were cracked from washing in lye, their eyes stung from the fumes of herbs burned in fear. And still, they kept walking from one patient to the next, from one deathbed to another, as if the motion itself could protect them. They became ghosts among the living, recognizable only by the long shadows they cast against the firelight. When a physician died, his mask was often buried with him, a strange monument to the war between ignorance and hope. The city would wait only a day before another man took his place, sealing himself inside the same garments, repeating the same gestures, believing perhaps that faith and fabric could hold back fate. For centuries, medicine had been built on observation, on the belief that reason could master the body. But now, reason trembled. The doctors began to suspect that their knowledge was not protection but pride. They stood on the edge of discovery, but the truth they sought lay beneath a scale too small to imagine. It would take generations before humanity would see what truly moved within the blood. In their failure, the healers revealed something deeper: the human need to act, even when action is hopeless. They washed the dying, comforted the delirious, and buried the fallen when no one else would. Their despair was not surrender, but devotion in its purest form, the will to stand in the presence of suffering, even when there is nothing left to save. And so they worked until their lungs filled with the same sickness they tried to cure. When the last breath left them, they were still dressed in their armor of linen and leather, still clutching the instruments of their art. The mask fell from their faces, and beneath it was not fear or wisdom, only exhaustion. They thought the mask would protect them, but it was only a mirror of their fear. Behind it, humanity stared at itself for the first time, fragile, curious, and unprepared for what the world could hold. If the healers could not help, perhaps faith could. And so, as the physicians fell silent, the gaze of the living turned upward, toward the heavens that had watched in silence since the first bell tolled. When the bells stopped ringing, even heaven seemed afraid to answer. For centuries, the church had been the pulse of Europe, its voice rising from cathedrals at dawn, its rituals binding kingdoms and peasants alike. Faith was not a choice but a rhythm. Prayers for rain, for harvest, for mercy. Every birth, every death, every breath belonged to the divine order. But now, as the plague consumed city after city, that rhythm faltered. The bells that once sang of salvation now tolled without pattern, marking not hours but bodies. Priests, who had stood fearless before kings, now trembled before the coughing of children. The holy water they sprinkled smelled faintly of smoke and fear. They carried crucifixes through empty streets, chanting psalms into the wind, their voices echoing from stone to stone. Yet with each procession, fewer returned. Monks collapsed mid-prayer, their robes falling into the dust beside the dead they meant to bless. In towns where once the faithful crowded the steps of the cathedral, only silence remained. And silence is a dangerous sound when it fills the space once held by God. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy, the pontiff ordered great fires to be lit around his chambers to cleanse the air. He blessed the smoke as holy protection, but even the papal city was not spared. Cardinals vanished one by one. The church's letters of indulgence fell unanswered. In villages far away, people began to whisper that the plague was a punishment not for the wicked, but for the priests themselves. If even the servants of heaven could die so easily, what hope was left for the rest of the world? The sermons turned darker. From pulpits, trembling voices proclaimed that the end of days had arrived, that Christ would soon return to judge the living and the dead. Crowds wept in the squares, confessing sins faster than breath, begging for forgiveness that no longer felt possible. But as the weeks turned to months, even the fire of repentance began to fade. The faithful had confessed, fasted, prayed, and still their loved ones fell. The plague became the final sermon, and its message was silence. Churchyards overflowed. The soil, once consecrated, could no longer hold the dead. Priests refused to touch the bodies, fearing the invisible contagion that mocked their prayers. In some towns, carts piled high, with corpses were rolled into open fields and set aflame. No hymns accompanied them, only the crackle of burning wood and the low sob of those who watched from afar. Faith, like the air, had grown heavy and uncertain. In the monasteries, the illuminated manuscripts were left unfinished. Gold leaf still clung to the edges of empty pages, waiting for the next verse that never came. Quills dried in their inkpots. The silence of the cloisters deepened into something unholy, a hollow where once there had been chanting. The monks who survived spoke of nights without dreams, of a God who had stopped speaking, and of prayers that felt like echoes falling back upon themselves. For the first time, people began to wonder if the church had ever truly understood the world it claimed to command. The priests had promised order, but the plague revealed only chaos. They had preached the power of divine mercy, but the streets showed only indifference. Beneath the weight of loss, faith began to bend, not shatter, but reshape itself into something quieter, more private. There were those who still clung to devotion. Nuns in the countryside tended to the sick when no one else would, washing sores with vinegar and tears. Their faith was no longer built on promise, but on endurance. They no longer prayed for miracles, only for the strength to bear witness. In their faces, the plague found its last resistance. Compassion, unspoken, undemanding, almost divine. But for many, belief curdled into anger. They turned on the church's wealth, its gold chalices and jeweled altars, demanding to know why heaven had grown silent while the earth drowned in sorrow. Some attacked the monasteries, others formed their own processions, self-appointed prophets who claimed new revelations from a God of vengeance. The old hierarchy began to crumble, not with rebellion but with disbelief. Every unanswered prayer was another crack in the foundation. The sacred music that once rose through cathedrals gave way to a new sound, the empty wind moving through broken windows. In some towns, the bells were melted down for coin, their metal repurposed to feed the hungry. The church's authority had been absolute, but now it wavered like candlelight before a storm. Even the clergy began to question. They asked quietly, in confessions whispered to one another. Had the world been abandoned, or had they simply misunderstood it all along? Faith had once promised certainty, but the plague taught doubt, and doubt is a seed that never dies. Out of that seed would grow new questions, new forms of belief, new defiance against the silence of heaven. The world that emerged would still pray, but differently, no longer upward toward the unreachable, but inward, toward the fragile human heart. When the bells stopped ringing, even heaven seemed afraid to answer. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but transformation. In that hush, the old world began to fade, and something unspoken began to take its place. A faith stripped of grandeur, trembling but alive. With both medicine and religion failing, the people turned inward. From that darkness, new rituals began to rise, desperate, wild, and born not of doctrine, but of fear and longing. The next chapter would not be about faith lost, but faith reinvented in the shadow of despair. When no God answered, they became their own sacrifice. Across a Europe shrouded in death, new processions began to appear, not of priests or healers, but of men stripped to the waist, their backs raw with blood and faith. They marched through silent towns in long, winding lines, singing hymns that rose and fell like waves against stone walls. In one hand, they carried a cross, in the other, a whip. Their rhythm was hypnotic, the crack of leather, the murmur of prayer, the steady tread of bare feet through mud and ash. They called themselves the Flagellants, pilgrims of pain, who believed that suffering could cleanse the world of its sin. The church had fallen silent, medicine had failed, and the plague seemed unstoppable. In that vacuum of certainty, pain became its own religion. Men who once worked in fields or markets now wandered from city to city, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their bodies marked by devotion. Every lash was a plea, every wound an offering to a heaven that had forgotten how to listen. They appeared first in Germany, then spread south and west, their processions multiplying like echoes of despair. Entire villages would pour into the streets to watch them pass. Some wept, others crossed themselves, others knelt in awe. For a moment, the sight seemed to promise order within chaos, a vision of control, of human hands reclaiming punishment from the divine. The air filled with the scent of sweat, iron, and incense. Drums beat in slow, measured time, guiding the movement as if the earth itself were breathing in rhythm with their pain. Each procession followed the same ritual. They would enter a town at dusk, chanting in Latin, barefoot despite the cold. At the square, they knelt in a circle and began to strike their own backs in unison. Blood darkened the ground beneath them. The crowd joined in prayer, repeating refrains that blurred the line between fear and worship. Mothers lifted their children to see, telling them these men were saving souls, that every drop of blood shed was another step toward forgiveness. For 33 days, one for each year of Christ's life, the Flagellants would travel, sleep on the bare earth, eat only bread and water, and flog themselves until exhaustion became grace. Then they would move on, leaving behind towns trembling with awe and unease. They claimed that angels had given them their mission, that heaven demanded their pain to lift the plague. Some believed them. Others saw something darker, the madness of men who had lost everything and found meaning only in suffering. The church watched with alarm. These processions were unblessed, ungoverned, their leaders self-appointed prophets who spoke of visions and punishment. They accused the clergy of corruption, declaring that salvation could no longer be bought with gold or absolution. Their sermons were filled with fire, their faith with fury. For the first time in centuries, the authority of the church faced a new rival, not heresy born of reason, but heresy born of agony. The Flagellants believed their pain could change the course of the plague, that each stroke of the whip was a nail driven into sin itself. But as they moved from town to town, the sickness followed them. Their gatherings became breeding grounds for contagion. Their blood, mixed with the dust of the streets, carried more death than deliverance. Yet they could not stop. To cease was to doubt, and doubt was the one thing they could no longer bear. Historians would later describe the movement as hysteria, but to those who witnessed it, it felt like revelation. People needed to see someone take control, even if that control meant destruction. In an age when unseen forces ruled life and death, visible suffering became a language everyone understood. The sight of flesh breaking beneath the whip gave shape to invisible fear. Pain, at least, could be measured. At night, when the processions camped beyond the city walls, the air pulsed with low chanting. Fires flickered over their wounds, turning them to shadows of crimson and gold. Some whispered that the sound of their prayers drew angels closer. Others said it drew only crows. A few broke away in silence, their faith consumed by fatigue, their backs scarred beyond healing. But the core of the movement endured, always moving, always bleeding, always searching for the end that never came. The people who watched were changed too. Some joined them, unable to bear their own helplessness any longer. Others locked their doors when the drums approached, fearing the contagion of both plague and madness. But even those who hid could not escape the sound, the rhythmic thud of whips, the soft rise of song. The echo of belief turned inward until it became obsession. The sound lingered long after the marchers had passed, a heartbeat carved into the memory of the land. It was said that when the Flagellants prayed, the stars dimmed. Perhaps it was only the smoke from their torches rising to the heavens. Perhaps it was something else, the weight of so many voices demanding answers from a sky that had grown weary of listening. They begged for mercy, but what they found instead was endurance. Pain became identity. Suffering became proof of existence. In their eyes, they were not victims but vessels of divine purpose. When no God answered, they became their own sacrifice. Theirs was a faith born not of hope, but of desperation, an act of rebellion against silence. They turned pain into prayer, blood into liturgy, fear into order, and in doing so they showed how thin the line can be between devotion and despair. But the plague did not only birth zealotry. Amid the noise of whips and the echo of hymns, quieter acts of compassion still flickered unnoticed, uncelebrated, but no less sacred. From this darkness, another kind of faith would soon rise, not built on suffering, but on kindness, fragile and human, a light that refused to die. Even when the world stopped breathing, someone still held another's hand. In the heart of the plague's darkness, where fear turned streets into deserts and faith into silence, a quieter story unfolded, one not written in records of kings or chronicles of death, but in gestures so small they nearly disappeared beneath history's weight. There were those who stayed when everyone else fled, nurses, monks, midwives, strangers with no family left to lose. They tended to the sick not for glory or salvation, but because someone had to. In convents and small parish houses, women boiled water over dwindling fires, washing the bodies of the dying in silence. They whispered prayers not for miracles, but for mercy. Their hands, raw from lie and fever, moved with the same gentleness they once used to cradle children. In monasteries, monks who had spent their lives copying sacred texts now tore those same pages into strips for bandages. They brewed herbs into poultices, not because they believed they would heal, but because doing something, anything, felt holier than doing nothing. In villages where every street had become a graveyard, small groups of caregivers moved through the night carrying lanterns. They knocked softly on doors, knowing what they would find. Sometimes they were met by silence, sometimes by a faint voice calling from the dark. They would enter, clean the wounds, wash the bodies, or simply sit beside the dying until the last breath left the room. In a time when no one wanted to touch another human being, their touch became sacred. The people called them mad. To care was to risk contagion, to invite death inside your own lungs. Yet the caregivers saw something different. They saw fear as the greatest sickness, the kind that spread even faster than the plague itself. Their work became an act of rebellion, defying the logic of survival. Every door they opened was a protest against extinction. Every hand they held said, "The world is not yet lost." They were not all holy men or saints. Many were simply neighbours who could not look away. Some were gravediggers who refused to leave a body unburied. Some were midwives who stayed to comfort mothers whose newborns never opened their eyes. A few were thieves, caught by circumstance and transformed by compassion. In Catastrophe, goodness became unremarkable, quiet, almost invisible, yet it endured. The chronicles of the time speak little of them. The monks who survived rarely named themselves, and the women who worked in silence left no signatures behind. But traces of them remain in the margins of history. Brief mentions of the Blessed Sisters of St. Clare, or those who washed the dead at night. For every 100 who ran, one stayed. And that one made the difference between a world that ended and a world that survived. There were moments, even in the worst days, when kindness illuminated the dark. A child orphaned by the plague found bread left on a doorstep, still warm. A monk too weak to stand was carried by another who would die before dawn. A nurse, her face veiled, sang softly as she cleaned the wounds of strangers. In these moments, mercy was not divine, it was human, fragile, fleeting, and therefore precious. Some believed that such compassion was contagious too, that each act of care softened the terror just enough for others to follow. A few of the dying smiled before they went. Their last sight, not a mask or a torch, but another human face. It was said that in certain towns where caregivers remained, the plague moved more slowly, as if even death paused before such defiance. Perhaps it did. Those who survived carried the memory of these small mercies like relics. Long after the plague had passed, they would recall the sound of footsteps in the dark, the knock on the door, the whisper, the touch that meant they were not alone. Compassion became the thread that stitched the torn fabric of the world back together. It did not stop the dying, but it reminded the living what it meant to be human. The plague had stripped away illusions of order, faith, and power. What remained was the simplest truth, that survival, in the end, is shared. The caregivers proved that courage is not loud, nor is love always redemptive. Sometimes, it is only the decision to stay one more night, to wash one more face, to breathe beside someone who cannot breathe alone. Even when the world stopped breathing, someone still held another's hand. In that fragile gesture, history found its quiet salvation not from the heavens, but from the trembling kindness that refused to die. But kindness cannot stop collapse. As the fires burned low and the last of the caregivers fell to the sickness they had defied, the fragile order they preserved began to unravel. The next chapter would reveal the consequence, a world that, stripped of its healers and faith, finally descended into the stillness of ruin. For the first time, the world looked exactly as it felt empty. The cities that once pulsed with noise and trade had fallen into a stillness so complete it seemed unnatural. The markets that had echoed with bargaining voices now held only the creak of wooden signs in the wind. In the courts where men once argued law, parchment curled to dust on long-abandoned tables. The plague had not only taken lives, it had erased the rhythm of civilization itself. The silence came slowly at first, like fog settling over stone. Each morning fewer footsteps could be heard. The baker stopped lighting his oven. The bell ringer stopped climbing the tower. The guards at the city gate disappeared one by one, their posts left unmanned, their spears leaning against the walls. Streets that had known the press of carts and horses now lay open, pale beneath the fading sun. Doors were nailed shut, windows darkened, as though the city itself had closed its eyes to avoid seeing its own reflection. Dogs wandered through the squares, gaunt and silent, sniffing at the thresholds of houses where their masters no longer stirred. Cats prowled the rooftops, moving like shadows between chimneys that no longer smoked. The smell of life had turned not the sweetness of bread or sweat, but the heavy scent of rot carried on the wind. Crows gathered on the steeples, their cries the only song left in the air. Even the wind seemed to move cautiously, unwilling to disturb the weight of absence that had settled across the land. In Venice, the canals grew still, the water dark and motionless as glass. The gondolas drifted untethered, bumping softly against each other, like bodies in a slow, indifferent tide. In London, the river ran past a forest of abandoned masts, ships left anchored by captains who would never return. In Florence, the narrow alleys smelled of smoke and salt, the remnants of fires lit to chase away the invisible. Cities that once competed for beauty now competed only for silence. Law disappeared as easily as laughter. There were no magistrates to settle disputes, no clerks to record the passing days. Money lost its meaning. No one left to trade with, no goods to desire. Some of the living broke into houses to take what they needed, moving through rooms as if trespassing in a dream. Others sat by their doors, waiting for anyone to walk by. When none did, they closed their eyes and waited for the end. In the countryside, the fields grew wild. Ploughs rusted in the furrows where farmers had dropped them. Sheep wandered without shepherds. Vines twisted through empty orchards. The rhythm of harvests, once the heartbeat of the world, stopped mid-season. Grain rotted in the barns, while the earth waited patiently for hands that would not return. The plague had ended the conversation between man and land, a silence as old as Eden itself. Inside the cities, the emptiness took on its own strange beauty. Without the hum of humanity, the world seemed to breathe again. You could hear the drip of rain from a broken gutter, the flutter of wings in the rafters of cathedrals. Candles burned themselves to the base in forgotten chapels, the wax pooling around the feet of saints. Their faces, carved in stone, looked down upon the emptiness with the same serene indifference as before, as if they too were waiting to be remembered. Those who survived walked carefully, as though stepping through the ghost of a dream. They avoided their own reflections in puddles, afraid to see what survival had made of them. Some left offerings on street corners, a loaf of bread, a flower, a prayer scrawled on parchment, not for God, but for the dead city itself. They spoke to walls and to windows, to the silence that answered everything. And yet, amid all that stillness, there remained a strange order. Nature crept in with quiet determination. Ivy climbed the walls of palaces, moss softened the cobblestones, and birds nested in the eaves of government halls. What the plague had erased, time began to reclaim. The world, it seemed, was learning how to exist without people. The hum of insects replaced the clamour of merchants, and the setting sun painted the ruins gold, as if forgiving them for what they once were. From afar, a city in ruin did not look dead, it looked asleep. The towers still reached toward the heavens, the bridges still crossed the water, but everything within them had gone still. Travellers who approached from the hills would stop and listen, expecting to hear bells or laughter. When none came, they turned away, unsettled by how beauty could survive without life. The emptiness itself became a kind of presence, vast and tender, reminding the world that silence, too, has its own sound. At night, the moon hung over the abandoned streets like a watchful eye. Its light spilled through broken windows, illuminating tables still set for meals never eaten. The shadows of chairs stretched long across the floor, as if the people who once sat in them had only stepped away for a moment. Time had paused, waiting for a signal that would never come. For those few who still moved through the emptiness, the gravediggers, the widows, the wandering children, survival felt less like victory and more like trespass. They were guests in a world that no longer recognized them. Each breath felt borrowed, each heartbeat an echo of something that had already ended. They learned to walk softly, to speak in whispers, as though afraid to wake the dead. And yet, beneath the desolation, something fragile endured a pulse, faint but real. The world, though wounded, had not stopped entirely. The rivers still flowed, the seasons still turned. The sun still rose over empty fields, indifferent but constant. Civilization had fallen silent, but the earth itself remained alive, waiting for new footsteps to stir its dust. For the first time, the world looked exactly as it felt empty. Yes, but also honest. All the noise, all the pride, all the illusion of permanence had been stripped away, leaving only the bare truth, that everything made by human hands is temporary, and every silence, in time, will be broken again. Amid the ruins, the survivors began to stir, haunted by a question greater than death itself. What does it mean to live after the end? Survival felt less like victory and more like punishment. In the aftermath of the plague, the world did not awaken to joy or gratitude, but to the hollow quiet of endurance. Those who remained walked through landscapes that no longer felt alive, where every object, every scent, every sound carried the memory of someone who was gone. The living had inherited not peace, but the unbearable privilege of breathing when others could not. They called it mercy, but it did not feel merciful. People spoke softly, afraid their voices might disturb the stillness left behind. The survivors lived as if they were trespassers in a world rebuilt from ashes, uncertain if they were meant to be here at all. Every sunrise carried a question. Why me? No priest could answer, no healer could explain. The plague had taken indiscriminately the young, the holy, the kind, and spared others for no reason at all. Those who endured learned to bear that mystery in silence. In the villages, the survivors gathered in half-empty squares, recognizing one another not by name but by loss. Conversations began with lists of the dead, a mother, a brother, an entire street. They spoke of them in whispers, as if the departed might still be listening. For many, grief blurred into superstition. Some believed the souls of the unburied lingered in the air, waiting for prayers never said. Others heard footsteps at night, or felt the cold breath of loved ones standing just behind them. In a world emptied of order, imagination became the only form of comfort left. The children of this time grew up among ghosts. They played in overgrown fields beside unmarked graves, unaware that the ground beneath their feet held generations. Their lullabies were fragments of mourning songs. Their games mimicked funerals more often than feasts. For them, Death was not a story told by elders, it was the landscape itself. And through them, the memory of the plague endured, not as a tale of history, but as an instinct, passed down quietly through the bloodstream of time. Some survivors could not stay where the dying had happened. They abandoned their homes and wandered, seeking places untouched by memory. They followed the old trade roads, now broken and overgrown, or sailed toward distant shores without knowing where they would land. To leave was not escape, it was a form of forgetting. But no matter how far they travelled, the silence followed. It lived inside them, a shadow stitched into their breathing. Others stayed, rebuilding their towns, one wall, one field, one prayer at a time. But even rebuilding felt hollow. They could not farm without thinking of the hands that once held the plough, could not open shop without seeing the face that once stood behind the counter. Every act of creation was also an act of remembrance. The living had become caretakers of absence, tending to spaces once filled by those they loved. In some places, madness took hold. People began to believe that survival required payment, that to live through such horror meant a debt was owed to the dead. They wore charms made from bones, whispered apologies before meals, and left offerings at the thresholds of ruined homes. To forget was to invite punishment. To remember was to never heal. There was no right way to grieve in a world that had lost its future. Night became the most difficult time. The survivors dreamed vividly of faces they could no longer picture by day, of voices calling from beyond locked doors. Some said the dreams were mercy, that the dead visited to reassure the living. Others said they were curses, reminders that no one truly escaped. Sleep became both refuge and torment, a place where the living and the dead still met. Among the ruins of churches, a few candles continued to burn. The people who tended them did so not for faith, but for memory. Each flame represented someone who had once existed, a fragile thread between past and present. The survivors no longer prayed for salvation. They prayed simply to keep remembering, as if memory itself were the last act of love left to them. The years that followed felt longer than the plague itself. Without the noise of daily life, time stretched thin. A single season could feel like a lifetime. People began to mark the passage of days by growth. A tree taking root in a graveyard, moss creeping across a fallen wall, the faint return of birds to empty skies. These small resurrections reminded them that the world, though changed, still moved forward. Yet within that motion lay a quiet ache, the realization that the world being rebuilt was not the same as the one lost. Every laughter that returned sounded hesitant, every wedding bell rang softer, every newborn cry felt like both hope and betrayal. To live again required a kind of forgetting, and forgetting felt like disloyalty to the dead. The survivors did not speak of guilt openly, but it threaded through every gesture, the way they touched one another carefully, the way they hesitated before joy. It was not the fear of dying that haunted them now, but the fear of living wrongly after so much had ended. They carried their memories like relics, not knowing whether to protect or release them. In time, stories replaced sorrow. The plague became myth, reshaped, softened, retold. Some said it had been sent by God to cleanse the world. Others said it had been a trial, a test of endurance. These stories made survival bearable. They gave meaning where none had existed. But beneath those stories, the truth remained simpler and more painful. That life goes on not because it is chosen, but because it refuses to stop. Survival felt less like victory and more like punishment. Yet within that punishment, a strange tenderness grew. The living learned to carry memory as both burden and gift. Every breath became a remembrance, every heartbeat a quiet defiance. They had walked through the end of the world and found that the world, somehow, still walked with them. As the dead outnumbered the living, a strange transformation began, not in bodies, but in minds. Belief, art, and meaning began to shift, reshaped by loss into something new. The next chapter would trace this awakening, how, from the ruins of despair, humanity began to dream again. When words failed, the dead began to dance. In the wake of the plague, when entire generations had vanished and silence had replaced song, Europe began to speak again, not through prayer or law, but through art. Brushes, chisels, and quills became the new instruments of confession. Pain, unable to find comfort in language, began to move through images instead. Walls that had once borne scenes of paradise now filled with bones, hourglasses, and shadows of the grave. Art became both wound and remedy, a way to remember, without collapsing under the weight of memory. In churches, frescoes bloomed like fever dreams. Skeletons waltzed with kings and queens in the dance macabre, a vision that spread across cathedrals and town halls alike. Death no longer crept in darkness, it danced in daylight, hand in hand with the living. No rank or crown could resist its pull. Bishops, peasants, lovers, and thieves all moved together in an endless circle, their faces half joy, half terror. The message was clear but not cruel. Death united what life had divided. For the first time, art spoke a truth that neither priest nor scholar had dared to say, that equality begins in the grave. The painters of the age were not merely craftsmen, but witnesses. Their pigments mixed with ash and sweat, their visions haunted by the smell of decay. They painted saints with hollow eyes, Madonnas holding not infants but memories. In their work, heaven drew closer to earth, not as a place of escape, but as reflection. Each brushstroke seemed to ask, what remains of the soul when everything else has gone? The colours deepened ochres like old wounds, reds like drying blood, blues so dark they seemed to remember night itself. Sculptors, too, found new language in stone. Tomb effigies that once showed peaceful repose now depicted decomposing flesh, ribs exposed beneath carved cloth. These were called transi-tombs, monuments to the body's return to dust. The dead lay not in serenity, but in honest decay, their marble faces confronting the viewer with the truth that beauty, like life, withers. And yet, in that withering, a strange grace emerged. To look upon these figures was not to despair, but to understand. They reminded the living that even decay can hold dignity. Music changed as well. The joyous hymns of the early church gave way to somber chants that echoed through empty choirs. Composers began weaving silence into sound pauses that lingered like held breath, dissonances that refused to resolve. Each note seemed aware of its own impermanence. Even the instruments mourned. The lutes and viols carried tones so fragile they seemed ready to break. Through this new melancholy, Europe found a strange form of healing, a beauty that acknowledged sorrow instead of hiding it. In illuminated manuscripts, artists no longer filled the margins with saints alone. Alongside the divine appeared grotesques and ghosts, tiny, dancing skeletons, devils grinning beside angels, skulls peeking from beneath flower vines. The sacred and the profane mingled freely, no longer enemies but reflections of one another. Faith had fractured, but imagination had survived, reshaping holiness into something human. The monks who once feared the silence now painted it, gilding emptiness with gold leaf, turning death into decoration. Art became therapy, a collective act of breathing again. It allowed people to look directly at what they could not speak to, give form to fear, to turn mourning into movement. Every mural, every carving, every piece of music became a quiet rebellion against oblivion. The act of creation itself was a declaration that not all was lost. Even in the presence of death, the hands of the living could still shape meaning. As time passed, the tone of art shifted from lament to reflection. Pain did not vanish, but it transformed into philosophy. Artists began to see death not merely as punishment, but as mirror showing life's fragility, its fleeting, exquisite nature. The dance macabre spread from the walls of churches to the pages of books, to stained glass and embroidery. Everywhere, the same image, the living and the dead intertwined, moving in endless rhythm. What had begun as a nightmare became a kind of acceptance, a reminder that the end was not chaos, but part of the design. In small workshops, apprentices learned to grind pigments that shimmered with dust from bones. They listened to the stories of their masters, who had lived through the dying and now painted their way out of silence. To paint after the plague was to confess survival, to say, I am still here, and so I will remember. The studios became sanctuaries, filled with the scent of oils and the murmur of brushes against plaster. Each creation, no matter how dark, was an act of light. And yet, beneath this flowering of expression, a shadow persisted. Every artist knew that beauty was born from loss. The more they remembered, the more they risked being consumed by memory. Some went mad, haunted by their own visions. Others found solace only in repetition, drawing the same skull, the same dance, again and again, as though tracing a spell that might keep the darkness contained. The line between reverence and obsession blurred until they became the same. Still, something miraculous emerged. Out of ruin came renewal. The art of the late plague years did not glorify despair, it humanized it. The dance macabre, though born of terror, became an anthem of endurance, the dance itself a metaphor for continuity. To dance with death was to admit fear, yet also to move beyond it. The people had learned that life could not be purified of pain. It could only be made meaningful through it. When words failed, the dead began to dance, and through that dance, the living learned how to move again. Brushes and chisels became the instruments of resurrection. Beauty did not banish grief, but it gave it shape, and in that shape, humanity rediscovered itself. From painting to philosophy, thought began to turn inward. If death was universal, perhaps the divine was not above man, but within him. The next chapter would follow that quiet revolution when the mind, freed from fear, began to search not for God in the heavens, but for meaning in the mirror. When God went silent, humanity began to think. In the long shadow of the plague, after prayers had gone unanswered and the last echoes of hymns had faded into the smoke of funeral pyres, Europe awoke into a strange new stillness, one not of despair, but of contemplation. Faith had once been the spine of existence, the invisible structure beneath every breath and act. But when the Church's words dissolved into the same silence as the dying, something shifted. The silence that once terrified became space, and into that space, thought began to grow. At first it was fragile, like grass sprouting through ash. People still knelt in chapels, still lit candles for the dead, but their prayers carried a new undertone, curiosity. Why had this happened? Why had the holy burned alongside the wicked? Why did the earth move by rhythms no scripture could explain? In that simple question, why, began a revolution deeper than any sword or sermon could carve. Scholars who had once copied sacred texts, word for word, began to look beyond them. They turned their gaze toward the natural world, not as a reflection of divine perfection, but as something real and knowable. Medicine, scarred by failure, began to evolve. Physicians observed, recorded, compared. They realized that healing required more than faith, it required understanding. Alchemists, once dismissed as dreamers, became early scientists, searching for order where others saw only punishment. The same hands that had once held relics now held instruments, lenses, and books. Doubt, once condemned as sin, became a form of courage. It was not rebellion but survival, a way to reclaim control in a universe that had proven unpredictable. For generations, Europe had lived under the assumption that truth came from above, delivered through holy intermediaries. Now, truth began to rise from below, from soil, from stars, from the structure of the human body itself. Every observation, every experiment, every quiet heresy was an act of defiance against despair. In universities, philosophy changed its tone. The thinkers who survived the plague had seen death up close, and that intimacy stripped abstraction of its comfort. They began to write not about heaven, but about humanity. Petrarch, who mourned friends lost to the plague, turned inward, writing letters not to saints, but to himself. He and others like him began to rediscover the ancient texts of Greece and Rome, works that had lain forgotten in monasteries for centuries. From those old words, a new idea emerged, that the center of the world might not be God, but man, fragile, reasoning, mortal man. Across Europe, libraries reopened their doors. Monks who once feared knowledge now guarded it as treasure. They copied not just scripture but philosophy, poetry, astronomy. The hunger for understanding spread quietly, as contagious as the plague had once been. The same routes that had carried death, the trade roads, the ports, the sea lanes now carried ideas. Scrolls from Byzantium, manuscripts from the Arab world, the geometry of Euclid, the medicine of Avicenna, all flowed westward, into hands ready to learn again. The wounds of the Black Death did not heal, they transformed. Suffering had emptied Europe of certainty, but in that emptiness grew a new kind of faith, not in divine order, but in human potential. People began to see creation itself as evidence of intelligence, not mystery. Painters studied anatomy to understand beauty. Mathematicians charted the heavens to glimpse their design. The boundary between art and science blurred. Both became forms of seeking. In the quiet corners of monasteries, some still feared what this questioning might unleash. They warned that curiosity was a temptation, that to search too deeply was to trespass upon the divine. But it was too late. The seed had already taken root in the hearts of those who had seen too much death to be afraid of knowledge. When one has watched the end of the world and lived, ignorance is no longer comfort, it is another kind of death. And so, the scholars began to ask not only how the world had broken, but how it worked. They observed stars that did not move, as Scripture said they should. They dissected animals, then human corpses, mapping the body's secrets. They began to measure, to record, to reason. They found that the world followed patterns, not miracles, but laws. This realization did not destroy faith entirely. It reshaped it. God, they thought, might not be the puppeteer pulling every string, but the architect who had built the stage. It was a subtle shift, almost invisible at first, but it changed everything. Once the church's authority had been absolute, now it was one voice among many. Once the world had been seen as a prelude to heaven, now it became a place worth understanding for its own sake. Curiosity became devotion. Observation became prayer. The art of the time reflected this awakening. Painters began to study light, shadow, and the human form not as symbols, but as truths. The body, once a vessel of sin, became a masterpiece of structure and grace. Architects designed cathedrals that soared not only in reverence, but in geometry, perfect ratios that mirrored the logic of creation. The divine and the earthly began to meet, not in opposition, but in balance. When God went silent, humanity began to think, and in that thinking, it began to remember itself. The plague had shown how fragile life could be, but also how vast the mind could grow in its search for meaning. Despair had cracked open the walls of certainty, and through those cracks poured light. What had begun as loss became the first breath of renewal. From this soil of doubt, the Renaissance would bloom a flowering of reason, art, and discovery, rooted in the memory of suffering. The same minds that once feared the wrath of heaven would soon chart the heavens themselves. The same hands that once buried the dead would carve the statues of gods reborn in human image. Doubt had not killed faith. It had taught it humility. And in that humility, humanity found a new beginning, one that would shape the centuries to come. The next chapter would follow how survival turned into adaptation, how from the ashes of fear and faith alike, a new order began to rise, rebuilding the living world. When half the world was gone, the rest learned its worth. The plague had emptied cities, silenced markets, and left the fields untended. Across Europe, the world's oldest order, the rhythm of lords and peasants, masters and servants, began to falter. For centuries, the structure of life had seemed unchangeable. Land belonged to the few, labor to the many, and survival was payment enough. But as death thinned the population, scarcity did what rebellion never could. It made the powerless valuable. At first, the change was invisible. Fields lay fallow, the ploughs rusted, and grain spoiled where no one remained to harvest it. Landowners, desperate to restore their fortunes, sent out messengers to nearby villages, offering higher wages to those who would work their estates. But there were fewer hands now, and those that remained began to realize their own rarity. What had once been obligation became negotiation. Peasants who had once bowed their heads now lifted their eyes and asked for pay, not permission. It was a quiet revolution, almost polite in its beginning. The earth itself had shifted the balance of power. Every life that remained became a currency greater than gold. A single shepherd could demand more for tending a flock than his father had earned in a lifetime. Craftsmen refused to work without fair coin. Servants left their masters to find better wages elsewhere, walking from manor to manor in search of better treatment. The roads, once filled with pilgrims and merchants, now carried something new, the free labourer. The nobles called it rebellion. To them, it felt like the world turning upside down. For centuries, wealth had flowed from the toil of others. Now, that flow reversed. Manor houses that had stood for generations began to crumble, not from attack, but from neglect. Without workers to tend the land, the foundations themselves began to rot. Power no longer resided solely in title or bloodline, but in the calloused hands of those who could make the land breathe again. laws were quickly written to stop the change. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers declared that no man should ask for more pay than before the plague. Across Europe, similar decrees echoed. The dead had changed the world, but the living were forbidden to notice. Yet no law could resurrect the lost. The simple truth of numbers defied royal command. If one man must do the work of three, he could name his price, and the lords, gritting their teeth, paid it. The shift was not only in labour, but in dignity. The peasantry, long chained to the land, began to glimpse the possibility of choice. A farmer might leave his field for a city workshop. A widow might sell her weaving directly in the market. A young man might refuse to inherit servitude. The plague had broken the chain of inheritance, not just of property, but of submission. In the quiet between one generation and the next, the idea of freedom was born. The church felt the tremor too. Donations dwindled, tithes went unpaid, and monks found their lands empty. The promise of salvation seemed less valuable when the world itself had already ended once. People began to look at their own labour as sacred not in the eyes of God, but in the reality of survival. Work became prayer, effort became worth. The sweat of one's brow was no longer punishment for sin, but the measure of self. In the towns, a new class emerged, skilled artisans, traders, and merchants, who no longer relied on noble patronage. The guilds swelled with members, their workshops glowing with the light of opportunity. The cities, though scarred, began to hum again, not with feasts or festivals, but with the rhythm of industry. From this hum, the middle class once unthinkable began to take shape. Still, the old order did not vanish without resistance. The lords, unable to command obedience, resorted to violence. Revolts flared across the continent, peasants demanding rights, nobles demanding obedience, kings demanding silence. Yet the plague had done what swords could not. It had taught the common people their value. Even those crushed by rebellion left behind the echo of defiance, and that echo would never fade. There was irony in this new world. The same catastrophe that had brought ruin also brought liberation. The emptiness left by the dead became space for new lives, new choices, new ambitions. The survivors rebuilt not just their homes, but their hierarchies. They learned that survival itself had currency, and that the measure of wealth was no longer divine favour, but human effort. Wages rose, diets improved, and for the first time in memory, the poor began to live not merely to endure, but to aspire. Children who would have been bound to fields learned trades, travelled to towns, or entered study. The flow of history had shifted quietly, persistently, irreversibly. What began as necessity became evolution. Yet even in prosperity, guilt lingered. Some wondered if this rise in fortune was built on the bones of the dead. Others feared that comfort would invite divine punishment again. The memory of the plague lay heavy over every meal, every coin exchanged. Gratitude and grief intertwined. Labour had become both survival and memorial. In the writings of the time, a new humility appeared, the recognition that no wealth could guarantee safety, and no poverty could erase worth. A farmer's life and a noble's life had proven equally fragile. Both had vanished beneath the same wind. The plague had democratized mortality, and in its aftermath, it democratized existence. When half the world was gone, the rest learned its worth. The survivors had rebuilt not through conquest, but through need. And though they could not have known it, their quiet revolution would change everything. The birth of wage labour, the decline of feudal power, the first pulse of modern economy. The world was learning that value did not descend from heaven. It was created by human hands. From the fields that once lay barren, a new kind of growth began, one of independence, of resilience, of identity. But freedom, like faith, demanded meaning. As the peasants and merchants shaped a new material world, others turned inward, seeking to rebuild the unseen. The next chapter would follow that search, how the same loss that freed the body also awakened the soul, and how new faiths rose quietly from the ashes of survival. When the temples crumbled, people began to build altars inside themselves. The plague had silenced the great cathedrals and humbled the priests. The old certainties of heaven and earth had fractured. But faith, like life, has a way of returning in new forms. Out of the ruins of the church's authority, 1,000 small beliefs began to bloom. They did not rise with trumpet or creed, but in whispers, in solitude, in the quiet yearning of those who had lost everything except the need to believe. In villages where no priest remained, people gathered in their homes to pray in secret. Some lit candles to saints the church no longer recognized. Others spoke directly to the dead, believing that souls might still walk among the living. Faith, once public and ceremonial, became intimate, a dialogue rather than a decree. The world no longer looked upward for salvation. It looked inward, into the trembling chambers of the human heart. The mystics came first. They were neither priests nor rebels, but wanderers, men and women who claimed to feel the divine not through ritual, but through experience. They spoke of visions seen in the silence of forests, of light found in stillness rather than scripture. Some lived as hermits in caves or huts, surviving on herbs and prayer. Others roamed from town to town, offering words that were neither entirely holy nor entirely heretical. They preached that God was not a distant ruler, but a presence within every breath, that the soul itself was a fragment of the divine. To the fearful, they were dangerous. To the desperate, they were healing. People came to them, not for doctrine, but for meaning, for reassurance that suffering was not emptiness, but a form of transformation. In their words, loss became purification, pain became passage. It was a faith without hierarchy, without walls. No bishop could contain it. No council could define it. It spread quietly, passed from heart to heart, the way light spreads through a forest at dawn. In Germany and the Low Countries, the Friends of God gathered in small, hidden communities. They believed that divine truth could be reached through inner contemplation rather than church authority. Their prayers were personal, their worship wordless. In Italy, figures like Catherine of Siena spoke of divine union through love and service, not penance or fear. In England, the Lollards began to question why scripture should be confined to Latin, demanding that it be read in the language of the people. Everywhere, the same theme emerged: faith returning to the individual, stripped of ornament, born again through simplicity. Not all movements were peaceful. Some turned their pain into prophecy, convinced that the plague had been only the first of many judgments. Visionaries declared that the end of the world was near, that only those who purified themselves through devotion or sacrifice would survive. Processions of barefoot penitents roamed the countryside once more, singing of revelation. But unlike before, these new zealots were not bound by Rome, they were bound by fear and freedom alike. The Church tried to contain this resurgence of personal spirituality, calling it dangerous, even blasphemous. But its authority had weakened beyond repair. The people who had buried their own dead, who had prayed in fields without priests, no longer needed intermediaries. Their faith had become self-sufficient, fragile perhaps, but genuine. They did not seek permission to speak to God. They already had. In small acts of devotion, new symbols appeared. A candle lit for a lost child became a sacred ritual. A song hummed during work became a prayer. The boundary between the sacred and the everyday began to blur. People no longer sought miracles from the sky. They found holiness in endurance, in love, in the faint persistence of hope. This was the quiet rebellion, faith without fear, spirituality without spectacle. In the art of the time, these changes shimmered softly. Painters depicted saints with eyes that looked not upward, but inward. Angels wept beside peasants, their wings tattered and human. Even the sacred texts began to shift in tone, less thunder, more whisper. Salvation was no longer painted in gold, but in dust and touch. Hermits, visionaries, and poets carried this new faith like torches through the darkness. They wrote of union with the divine as something found in silence, not ceremony. They taught that prayer could be listening instead of speaking, that the divine could be found not in churches but in compassion. It was a dangerous idea that holiness might live within every person. Yet it spread because it comforted. After a century of fear, the promise of inner peace felt revolutionary. When the temples crumbled, people began to build altars inside themselves. It was not the death of faith, but its rebirth, a faith that needed no permission, no priest, no structure. Out of the ashes of catastrophe, spirituality had become personal, intimate, unspoken. People learned to trust the stillness within more than the voices without. Faith and economy had changed, and with them, the very rhythm of life. But something deeper was shifting still. Time itself felt altered. Centuries seemed to pass within a single lifetime, and the memory of the plague continued to echo through every clock and calendar. The next chapter would reveal how the Black Death did not just destroy the past, it rewrote humanity's sense of time itself. When so many vanished, even time forgot how to count. In the years that followed the plague, the clock still ticked, the sun still rose, but the rhythm of life no longer matched the turning of the heavens. The world's pulse had been broken. In chronicles and manuscripts, sentences ended mid-thought, ink trails fading where the hand that wrote them had stilled. In the year of our Lord, one scribe had begun and never finished. Across monasteries and courts, records stopped, not with conclusion, but with absence. It was as though history itself had caught the sickness. The medieval world had once believed time was a divine river beginning in creation and flowing inevitably toward judgment. Every day, every year, had been a step on that sacred path. But the plague tore the calendar in half. So many priests were dead that feast days went unmarked. So many scribes were gone that no one recorded the passing months. The seasons blurred. In some regions, the dead were buried without date or name. What had been ordered and eternal became uncertain, chaotic, unmoored. In towns that had lost half their people, no one knew what year it was. The farmers counted not by harvests, but by losses. The surviving children grew without clear sense of age. They measured their lives not in birthdays, but in the number of winters since the sickness came. Time became circular, like grief. It returned each year in memory, but never truly moved forward. The bells that once divided the day into prayer and labour were silent now. The rhythm of faith, work, and rest dissolved into one long, indistinguishable hour. Even the sky seemed altered. Chroniclers wrote of blood-red sunsets and seasons that came too soon or too late. The old cycles, planting, fasting, celebrating no longer fit. Without their rituals, people drifted. They forgot when to sow or reap, when to mourn or rejoice. What had once been structure now became uncertainty. To live after the plague was to live outside of time a survivor in an age that no longer had meaning for survival. In monasteries, the few monks who remained tried to reconstruct the lost years. They copied half-finished records, estimating missing dates from memory. But memory itself had frayed. They wrote of the great dying, of the year when none came to mass, of the winter of silence. Years became adjectives instead of numbers. The precise became poetic. 1,000 timelines collapsed into metaphor. For ordinary people, time grew personal. Without the church's calendar to guide them, they measured life by their own cycles. The recovery of a child, the return of spring, the rebuilding of a house. Communities began to tell stories not by when they happened, but by what they survived. Before the plague, they would say. After the plague, the event became the clock itself, the hinge upon which existence turned. History was no longer a line, but a wound. In art, this fracture became visible. Painters abandoned the golden backgrounds of eternity that once framed holy scenes. Instead, they painted shadow, depth, perspective, the illusion of passing time. It was as though the world, having glimpsed death, now needed to prove motion again. The static perfection of the medieval age gave way to movement, folds of cloth in mid-air, faces caught between moments. From loss came realism not only in art, but in consciousness. Humanity, for the first time, began to see itself as living in time, not beyond it. The plague had not just thinned populations, it had thinned continuity. The old families, whose names had stretched back centuries, vanished. Apprentices died before masters could teach them. Songs broke off halfway through generations. The chain of memory that linked past to present snapped in 1,000 places. What survived did so by chance, fragments of stories, pieces of scripture, ruins of architecture. It was as if the world had woken to find its own reflection incomplete. Those who survived became guardians of fragments. They repeated stories to children who would never know the people in them. They rebuilt calendars with guesses, trying to stitch the flow of time back together with trembling hands. Yet even in this effort, something new emerged, an awareness that time was not guaranteed, that history could end not with apocalypse, but with forgetting. This was perhaps the plague's deepest scar, not the graves, but the silence that followed them. Across Europe, different regions began their own reckonings. Some declared the year 1350 the beginning of mercy. the symbolic end of divine punishment. Others refused to count those years at all, calling them the blank years. For chroniclers, it was impossible to know where to resume the story. What does one write after the end? The very act of dating an event felt strange, almost defiant, as though naming a year could rebuild its reality. And yet, time slowly returned, not as command, but as choice. Bells were recast, calendars redrawn. The first festivals after the plague were hesitant, half in mourning, half in hope. The people danced not because they had forgotten, but because they needed to remember differently. They began to create new holidays not of saints or kings, but of survival. The marking of time became an act of resilience. When so many vanished, even time forgot how to count. It took a generation for the world to learn again. The children who grew up among the ruins carried no clear memory of before. To them, history began with emptiness, and so they filled it. They became builders, thinkers, creators, reshaping the future as if the past had been erased for a reason. In their hands, time became human again, measured not by divine will, but by endurance, effort, and change. The calendar, once broken, became a mirror. It no longer promised eternity, it reflected fragility. The ticking of a clock, the passing of a season, even the turning of a page became reminders of what could vanish. Time, like life, had to be remade one day at a time. The chronicles would never recover the missing years. They remained blank, like pages burned from a book. But perhaps that emptiness was necessary. In forgetting, the world found room to begin again. The next chapter would reveal how memory, though fractured, fought its way back, how humanity rebuilt the story of itself through monuments, myths, and the fragile art of remembering. What we remember of death decides how we live. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, what remained was not merely ruin, but remembrance, the quiet effort to make sense of survival. Europe, though scarred, began to remember itself, slowly, carefully, as if memory were another form of resurrection. The plague had erased generations, silenced languages, and broken time itself. But in that void, something profound began to take shape. The need to record, to pass on, to ensure that the horror would never vanish into silence again. In monasteries, the survivors picked up their quills and began to write once more. Their handwriting trembled, their ink sometimes blotched by tears or shaking hands, but line by line, the chronicles returned. They did not write of victory or redemption, only of endurance. They listed the names of the dead, the towns erased, the kings who fell alongside peasants. Some wrote of the smell of decay, others of the silence afterward. They wrote because writing was a form of control, a way to trap chaos within the boundaries of a page. In their words, memory became a defense against forgetting, a fragile wall between the living and the void. Artists, too, joined this act of remembrance. Frescoes of the Danse Macabre appeared on church walls, skeletons dancing with the living, laughing in the faces of bishops and beggars alike. These were not simply paintings of fear, but of understanding. They reminded people that death was the one thing shared by all, a rhythm that could not be escaped, but perhaps could be faced. Pain became pattern. Terror became art. In the brushstrokes of that grim beauty, Europe found a strange peace. In villages and countryside chapels, oral memory flourished. Old women told stories by firelight, tales of the dark years, of the signs in the sky, of the miraculous survivors who outwitted death through cunning or grace. Some stories warned against pride, others against cruelty. In every one, the plague was not only a punishment, but a teacher. It had stripped humanity bare, revealing what endured beneath: kindness, fear, endurance, faith. Through these tales, people transformed suffering into moral inheritance. The lessons of the dead became the wisdom of the living. Songs emerged, too soft, repetitive melodies meant to soothe restless souls. They spoke of loss, but also of continuity, of a world still turning. Children who had never seen the plague learned its rhythm through rhyme. The wheel turns, the world burns, and still the seed is sown. Such lines, sung half in sorrow and half in hope, carried memory forward in ways the written word could not. Where books might burn, voices could survive. The monuments rose next, crosses at crossroads, statues of saints who had watched the dying, bells forged from melted chalices. In some towns, they carved lists of names into the stone, entire families, entire generations, reduced to words. These memorials were not grand, but intimate. They were acts of gratitude more than grief, acknowledgements that memory itself was sacred. To remember was to rebuild, even if only in spirit. Yet remembrance was not only external, it lived within. The survivors carried it in their habits, their caution, their quietness. They stored food longer than needed, prayed shorter prayers, built homes farther apart. They taught their children humility, not the kind preached by the church, but the humility of knowing how easily everything could disappear. Even joy was tempered, measured carefully, as if laughter too loud might wake the sleeping shadow of the past. But over generations, the memory began to change. The horror softened into history, the grief into lesson. Artists painted the plague not as nightmare but as allegory. Death no longer the destroyer, but the equalizer, the reminder. In illuminated manuscripts, the skeletal figures became strangely graceful, their hollow eyes not menacing but knowing. Death, once a thief in the night, had become a teacher seated at the table of life. The scholars who studied these centuries later would call it resilience, but for those who lived it, it was simply the way forward. They had learned that memory was not meant to imprison, but to protect. To remember was to prepare to build systems, rituals, and compassion that could withstand the next disaster. The birth of hospitals, the rise of quarantine, the very idea of public health, all of it began with memory. The plague had taught humanity that survival required not only strength, but remembrance. In the centuries that followed, echoes of the Black Death continued to ripple through thought and art. Every new illness, every whisper of pestilence, carried its ghost. Painters in later ages still drew inspiration from that dark dance between life and death. Writers invoked it as symbol of loss, of renewal, of the fragile line between order and chaos. The memory of the plague became a mirror through which Europe watched itself grow. And yet, even as time softened its edges, something eternal remained. Beneath the progress and reason of later centuries, the old wisdom still hummed, that life is borrowed, that meaning is made in the shadow of mortality. The plague had taught that civilization is not a wall but a heartbeat, fragile, rhythmic, capable of faltering at any moment. That knowledge, painful as it was, became part of the soul of modernity. What we remember of death decides how we live. The people who rebuilt Europe did not forget they carried the plague within their memory like a scar and a warning. Every tower they raised, every song they sang, every law they wrote carried the echo of that silence. In remembering death, they rediscovered life. And so the memory endured not only in archives or monuments, but in the quiet resilience of ordinary lives. In the way people paused before joy, in the way they cherished warmth against the cold. The past did not vanish. It whispered beneath every new beginning, reminding the living what it had cost to begin again. As time stabilized, memory deepened. The plague faded into history, but its fingerprints remained everywhere in the art, the faith, the structure of thought, even in the pulse of modern time. The next chapter would uncover those invisible marks, the legacy of the Black Death itself, and how the echo of that dark century still shapes the world we live in today. Humanity was reborn not in triumph, but in understanding. Out of the silence left by the Black Death rose a new sound, the murmur of thought. The old world, built on obedience and fear, had cracked open, and through its fractures came something unexpected: curiosity. In the ashes of loss, the human mind began to awaken, not to miracles, but to itself. For centuries, people had lived in a universe explained entirely by faith. God had spoken through priests, truth had descended from above. But the plague had rewritten that script. It had proven that divine order could shatter, that the innocent could perish alongside the wicked, that the heavens might stay silent even as the earth burned. The catastrophe left behind a terrible gift, the necessity to think. If certainty could die, then doubt could live. And in doubt, the seeds of modernity began to bloom. The survivors, scholars, artists, craftsmen, inherited a world without guarantees. They had seen the fragility of existence and the futility of blind belief. And so, they turned their gaze toward the tangible. They studied the body, the sky, the soil. They measured, recorded, dissected. What had once been heresy, to question, to test, to seek, became survival itself. The plague had taught that knowledge was not rebellion, it was resistance to chaos. In Italy, where the echoes of death had passed through marble streets and empty piazzas, a new vision of humanity emerged. Artists like Giotto and later Brunelleschi began to paint and build as if to prove that life, though temporary, could still approach perfection. Geometry replaced divine mystery, perspective replaced symbolism. The human form, long hidden beneath robes of piety, re-emerged as sacred in its own right. Flesh was no longer shameful, it was miraculous, the visible expression of existence itself. The philosophers followed. In the writings of Petrarch and later Erasmus, a quiet revolution of language began. They wrote not in Latin for the church, but in the tongues of the living, for the living. They rediscovered the works of the ancients, Cicero, Aristotle, Lucretius, and in those forgotten pages found a new mirror for the human soul. The message was simple but profound, that reason too could be divine. From this soil of survival grew humanism, the belief that man was not merely the subject of creation, but its witness and interpreter. The human mind, they realized, was capable of shaping reality as much as it was shaped by it. The same hands that once buried the dead now built cathedrals of thought, raising questions higher than any spire. Where once people had asked, "What does God will?" they now began to ask, "What can we know?" Science was not born in a single moment of revelation, but in a slow turning of the gaze. Astronomers began to map the heavens not as a hierarchy of angels, but as a vast mechanical clock. Physicians began to open the human body, seeking answers in muscle and bone rather than miracle and myth. Mathematicians found harmony in numbers, seeing divine beauty not in prophecy but in proportion. The plague had stripped away illusion, and in its place, humanity discovered observation. There was humility in this awakening. To study the world was to accept one's smallness within it, to see that life's meaning was not written in the stars but carved in the choices of men. Yet there was also awe, for the same universe that had brought death could also yield understanding. Knowledge became the new form of faith, built not on the promise of eternity, but on the pursuit of truth. And with knowledge came individuality. The collective voice of the medieval world, the chants, the councils, the unquestioned unity of belief began to fracture into singular tones. People started to write in the first person, to record not only what happened but what they felt. Diaries replaced hagiographies, observation replaced confession. Humanity discovered itself not as a mass, but as a multitude of selves, each capable of thought and worth. The arts mirrored this awakening. Painters gave emotion to faces, sculptors carved movement into stone. Music, once bound to liturgy, began to explore harmony and dissonance as reflections of the human condition. It was as if the world, having stared into silence, had rediscovered the beauty of sound complex, fragile, alive. Every act of creation became a defiance against the memory of the grave. But beneath this renaissance of thought lay the memory of suffering. The modern mind was not born innocent, it was born remembering. Every discovery carried with it the echo of loss, the quiet awareness that progress was not redemption, only endurance. The thinkers of this new world did not deny mortality, they studied it. They learned to see death not as punishment, but as part of the design, a necessary counterpart to meaning. From death came modernity not through conquest, but through contemplation. The Black Death had reduced humanity to its essence, and in that reduction revealed its depth. People no longer sought to escape the human condition, they began to explore it. They realized that to understand the world was not to deny mystery, but to illuminate it. Science and art, once enemies of faith, became its heirs, inheriting the desire to find order in chaos. Humanity was reborn not in triumph, but in understanding. The Renaissance was not a rejection of the past, but its transformation. Every invention, every theory, every painting carried the faint signature of the plague, the awareness that life was fleeting and therefore infinitely precious. From the cemeteries of Europe rose the architecture of reason. From the ashes of despair, the geometry of hope. And yet, amid this awakening, a deeper question began to stir, one that knowledge alone could not answer. If the mind could master the world, could it also master fate? If humanity could build anew, could it also choose its destiny? These questions lingered like echoes beneath the triumph of progress, waiting for an answer that reason alone could not provide. Human progress had begun, the body rebuilt, the mind reborn. But something older and quieter still called from beneath it all, the question of purpose, the whisper of destiny. And it is there that the story of the Black Death, and of humanity itself, would turn once more. The plague did not end us. It edited who we became. Beneath the graves and silence, beneath the prayers and despair, something deeper was taking shape. Not merely recovery, but transformation. Humanity, reshaped by death, began to live differently, think differently, even dream differently. The Black Death was not only an ending, it was a rewriting of destiny itself. At first, the change was invisible. The survivors did not see themselves as chosen, only spared. Yet in their bodies, unseen alterations began traces, written quietly into bloodlines. Centuries later, science would uncover what no one then could know, that certain genes, those which strengthened the immune system's defenses, spread among the descendants of the living. The plague had culled, but it had also refined. Evolution, indifferent and patient, had turned suffering into selection. Humanity's very biology carried the memory of survival. But the deeper transformation was not of the flesh, it was of the spirit. The old world, ruled by fear and divine hierarchy, had fractured beyond repair. The survivors had faced a silence so complete that even God seemed to vanish inside it. And in that absence, humanity discovered its own voice. The question of destiny, once dictated from above, now turned inward. What if meaning did not descend from heaven? What if it was something built, day by day, by human hands? From that question flowed everything that followed: science, humanism, philosophy, revolution. The plague had stripped away illusion, and what remained was raw awareness. People saw that the boundaries of fate were not fixed. They could be redrawn by knowledge, by will, by imagination. The old medieval certainty that life's path was predetermined dissolved into possibility. Destiny, once a map drawn by gods, became an unwritten page held by man. In this new world, suffering was not merely endured, it was studied, understood, and in some strange way, honoured. The memory of death taught compassion, and compassion became power. Politics shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Monarchs who had once ruled by divine right now faced subjects who had lived through apocalypse and returned. The myth of unchangeable order cracked. From the ashes of serfdom came the language of rights. From the collapse of certainty came the idea of choice. Art carried this transformation in its colours. The paintings of the centuries that followed glowed with an awareness that beauty was transient, the softness of light, the impermanence of flesh. The very act of depicting life became an act of defiance against death. Where medieval art had sought eternity, Renaissance art celebrated the moment. To capture life as it was breathing, flawed, luminous, was to acknowledge that nothing, not even death, could erase its meaning. Even religion, wounded but enduring, began to evolve. The church had been shaken but not destroyed. It reformed, fractured, reassembled, and with each shift became less a fortress of control and more a field of conversation. Mysticism gave way to reflection, superstition to conscience. People no longer sought salvation in collective obedience, but in personal understanding. Faith became quieter, humbler, not thunder, but whisper. The divine was no longer a distant ruler, but a companion in uncertainty. The plague had forced humanity to look inward, and in doing so, it had awakened the self. The idea of the individual, once unthinkable in a world defined by hierarchy, began to take hold. People began to see themselves not just as part of creation, but as creators. To work, to think, to feel, these became sacred acts. The birth of self-awareness was not born from comfort, but from crisis. It was through loss that the human mind learned to see itself clearly. Even nature was reimagined. Where once it had been viewed as a backdrop for divine will, it was now seen as a system vast, knowable, and alive. The plague had shown how intimately the world was connected. The flea on the rat, the merchant on the ship, the city and the sea. Out of horror came understanding that existence itself was a web, fragile yet infinite. The sense of separation between man and world began to fade. Humanity, humbled, began to listen to the planet again. Psychologically, something subtle shifted too. The survivors of the 14th century carried an inherited memory, a whisper of caution, a quiet awareness of impermanence. It shaped how people built, how they loved, how they feared. Grand ambitions were tempered by the knowledge that everything could end. That awareness still lingers in us, in our rituals of mourning, in our fascination with apocalypse, in our art that keeps returning to themes of ruin and rebirth. The plague taught humanity how to live with memory as both burden and guide. And yet, for all the pain it brought, the Black Death also gave something profound: perspective. It redefined the scale of human existence. Against the immensity of loss, the survivors learned to see the beauty of small things: a candle in the dark, the sound of laughter, the warmth of another's hand. Life, stripped of guarantees, became sacred precisely because it was fragile. The plague did not end us. It edited who we became. It reshaped our story not as tragedy alone, but as transformation. It taught us that creation and destruction are not opposites, but mirrors. From the collapse of faith came reason. From the loss of millions came empathy. From the failure of systems came the birth of freedom. The catastrophe did not erase destiny. It rewrote it in human language. Every modern idea, democracy, science, individuality, art, carries the faint echo of those years when the world seemed to stop breathing. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, even the modern age of medicine, all are descendants of that silence. The plague had taught that knowledge must walk hand in hand with humility, that survival without meaning is hollow, and that progress is not measured by conquest, but by awareness. What emerged from the Black Death was not just a new Europe, but a new consciousness, one that saw both the darkness and the light as parts of the same truth. Humanity learned that destiny is not given. It is made, remade, and remembered. The plague did not curse us with mortality. It reminded us of our inheritance to endure, to question, to create. The survivors did not rebuild the old world. They built a different one, a quieter, wiser one. The age of faith had ended. The age of understanding had begun. But even understanding carries its own mystery, a reminder that in every era, the same questions return, waiting to be asked again. And so the story turns once more toward remembrance, toward the dark that shaped the light. The next and final chapter will fall into stillness again, a reflection not on what the plague destroyed, but on what it revealed, what history still whispers to those who listen in the dark. Every time we wash our hands, we remember without knowing it. The past, though buried under centuries of dust, still moves beneath our skin, a quiet rhythm inherited from those who lived through the Black Death. The plague never truly ended. It only changed shape, dissolving into instinct, into the patterns of behavior we call ordinary. The fear that once swept through medieval streets now lives inside the small gestures of safety we perform without thought. Closing a window, avoiding a stranger's cough, tidying a room as if order itself could keep chaos at bay. Centuries have passed, and yet the echo remains. Humanity learned to live with the invisible, to fear what cannot be seen, to guard against what cannot be predicted. The survivors of the 14th century carried that lesson forward, and we, their descendants, still obey it. The memory of contagion has become ritual: soap, distance, cleanliness, caution. Every act of hygiene is an heirloom, a relic of terror refined into routine. What once was prayer has become practice. In medieval times, people burned herbs and carried perfumed pouches to ward off bad air. Today, we sterilize, sanitize, disinfect. The tools have changed, but the impulse is the same: to create a fragile barrier between ourselves and the unseen. It is not just survival, it is remembrance, encoded through repetition. The plague taught us that danger hides in the smallest things, and that the act of care, however futile, is also a form of faith. Even our architecture remembers. The narrow alleys of old cities widened after the plague. Air and space became medicine. Windows grew larger, streets straighter. The very design of our living spaces is shaped by the ghost of that time, a silent acknowledgement that light and distance save lives. Urban planning, sanitation, public health, all were born from those years when people learned that to control disease was to understand the flow of life itself. But memory is not only physical, it is emotional. The plague imprinted on our collective mind a need for control, a fragile illusion against the randomness of existence. We seek patterns, explanations, order in the face of the unknowable. From that ancient chaos arose our systems, our sciences, our philosophies. Even our stories of apocalypse, from religion to cinema, echo the same fear, that the world can vanish in a breath, and that our only defense is understanding. When modern pandemics strike, when cities lock down and silence returns, we are not experiencing something new, we are remembering. The same hush falls over the streets, the same eyes look through windows wondering who will survive. History does not repeat itself, it reverberates. Each generation hears the echo differently, but it is the same sound. Footsteps fading into empty streets, hearts beating faster in the quiet. And yet, in that fear, there is also continuity, a lineage of resilience. The people of the 14th century did not only pass down their terror, they passed down their endurance. The instinct to protect one another, to rebuild, to adapt, has become part of who we are. It lives in our medicine, our empathy, our curiosity. Every vaccine, every cure, every act of healing is a monument to those who once faced death without understanding and survived anyway. The echo of the plague is not just in our fear, but in our compassion. We learned that isolation can kill as surely as disease, that touch, though dangerous, is sacred. We learned that grief binds more strongly than doctrine, and that even in loss, connection endures. The humanity that emerged from the ashes of the Black Death was not colder, it was deeper. To live with memory is to live with empathy. Even language carries the residue of those centuries. Words like quarantine, contagion, crisis, and recovery all trace their origins to that time. They have become part of our daily vocabulary, reminders that history hides in speech, waiting to be recognized. Every phrase of precaution, every sentence of hope carries the weight of forgotten centuries. We speak the language of survival without realizing who first taught it to us. In the rhythms of modern life in hospitals, in rituals of mourning, in the news that travels faster than breath, we can still feel the shape of that ancient fear. But perhaps it is not fear at all. Perhaps it is awareness. The plague made humanity conscious of its fragility, but also of its continuity. We are the result of countless quiet victories, the hands that washed, the candles lit, the hearts that refused to stop beating. The Black Death changed us in ways we can no longer see, but always feel. It taught us to value time, to build systems, to trust knowledge, to find meaning in uncertainty. Every scientific discovery, every philosophical question, every medical triumph carries its DNA. From the monasteries that burned incense to the laboratories that sequenced genomes, the impulse is the same, to understand what threatens us so we can continue to live. Even the arts, remember. Modern works about apocalypse, survival, and rebirth are not new stories. They are old ones retold in modern voices. When we imagine the end of the world, we are echoing the 14th century's memory of its own. The fascination with collapse is not morbid curiosity. It is ancestral recall, a rehearsal for resilience. We dream of endings because we have survived them before. Every time we wash our hands, we remember without knowing it. Every time we pause before a crowd, or trace the source of a rumor, or build a model of a virus, we are repeating gestures born in that forgotten age. The plague never left. It transformed into awareness. Its shadow falls softly across our modern light, not as threat, but as teacher. And perhaps this is what survival truly means, not escaping death, but learning from it. The echo of footsteps on cobblestone, the whisper of prayers behind closed doors, the trembling hands that dared to touch again, these moments did not fade. They became the foundation of who we are. The story has circled back to now. The world that began in silence ends in reflection, a reminder that every heartbeat carries an inheritance. The past is not behind us, it walks beside us, unseen but present, reminding us that the end was never truly an ending. The next and final section will bring that realization to stillness, the closing of the circle, from silence to survival, from ending to renewal, from memory to meaning. It will not ask what was lost, but what was found, what humanity still carries in the quiet echo of its own survival. The dead became our teachers, and their silence, our map. In the centuries since the Black Death, humanity has walked forward, step by uncertain step, carrying with it the lessons of that dark season. The plague was not just an event, it was a revelation written in sorrow. It stripped life down to its essence and, in doing so, revealed what endures when all else falls away. The final gift of the plague was not fear, it was perspective. When the bells stopped ringing and the fires cooled, what remained was not despair, but the quiet knowledge of continuity. Humanity had seen its own end, and yet continued to breathe. The survivors did not rebuild the same world. They built a wiser one. Beneath the grief, beneath the ruin, they discovered a truth that time has never erased, that fragility is not weakness, but proof of life itself. The Black Death taught that civilization is as mortal as the people who build it. Its monuments crumble, its systems falter, its laws dissolve. But humanity, the pulse, the thought, the empathy endures. Every plague, every war, every collapse since then has echoed that same truth. What survives is not the structure, but the spirit. The plague revealed that endurance does not come from strength alone, but from the ability to adapt, to imagine, to care. In the centuries that followed, the memory softened but did not fade. It became a whisper inside progress, a reminder hidden in every achievement that everything we hold can be lost, and therefore must be cherished. Science, medicine, art, all were born from that single understanding, that life is temporary and therefore sacred. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern world, all carry the faint imprint of the 14th century's silence. The world learned that knowledge is not luxury but survival, that ignorance can kill as swiftly as disease. From that understanding came the pursuit of reason, the birth of science, the idea that truth could be discovered rather than decreed. Humanity learned to question, not because it was rebellious, but because it was afraid and in that fear found wisdom. The pursuit of understanding became an act of hope, a way to defy extinction through awareness. But the deepest lesson was not written in books. It was written in the heart. The plague had shown that kindness, even in the smallest act, mattered more than faith or rank. A cup of water given to the dying, a hand held through fever, a burial made with dignity, these were the true victories of that time. From such gestures grew the modern conscience, the quiet ethics that still shape us, that compassion, not conquest, defines civilization. In every generation since, the world has faced its own darkness, wars, famines, new plagues, and each time the same questions return. What endures? What do we owe to one another when the world trembles? The Black Death left no direct answers, only echoes. But perhaps that is enough. For the echo itself reminds us that we are not the first to stand in fear, and not the first to stand again after it. The dead became our teachers and their silence, our map. Their lesson was simple. Nothing lasts, and that is why everything matters. Every breath, every kindness, every act of creation is defiance against oblivion. The plague taught humanity to see beauty not in permanence, but in persistence. The candle's glow is brief, and that is precisely why we cherish its light. Tonight, when cities sleep beneath, electric stars and screens flicker with stories of past and future, that same ancient awareness hums beneath it all, the sense that life is fragile, precious, and fleeting. We still live in the shadow of that long-ago silence, but we have learned to fill it with music, laughter, and thought. The lesson of the Black Death is not to fear the dark, but to understand it, to see in it the space where meaning is made. And so history exhales, the voices fade, the candles gutter, the streets grow still. The world that once ended is now the world we inhabit, its echoes woven through every breath we take. The story has come full circle, from noise to stillness, from chaos to calm, from ending to awareness. If you listen closely, you can still hear them not as ghosts, but as memory. The footsteps of those who walked before us, the heartbeat of those who rebuilt, the quiet courage of those who dared to believe there would be another dawn. Their silence is not absence, it is instruction. It tells us that we have survived before, and will again. The dead became our teachers. Their silence became our map. And their greatest lesson whispered through the centuries is this, that every ending carries the seed of beginning, and that to live is not to forget, but to remember softly. The candle burns low. The story closes. The world exhales. And somewhere, in the stillness that follows, humanity begins again.